the students created a profile of who they thought the killer would likely be. A truck driver, a white man, heterosexual, in the right age range, height, troubled background, all of these details. And Jerry Johns fit it to a T. It was really remarkable what they managed to do. They have this incredible teacher. He's called Alex Campbell. And he was looking for ways to engage and to inspire his pupils and to get them more interested in the coursework. And he was a big fan of true crime stories himself. That was in large part due to his wife, who was obsessive about the whole genre. And so he decided that he was going to set them an unusual project. And this project was to see whether they could solve, or at least have a look at, a cold case in the region that was 35 years old. It's really remarkable what they achieved. And actually, they're all still quite stunned about it. I mean, one of them, I met him in this coffee shop where I am now. And I was talking to him about it. And he said, you know, even now I talk to some of my friends at work and I say, did I ever tell you about the time that I played a role in solving a cold case 35 years on? And his friends say, nah, you didn't do that. He's like, I did. But what they did was they started off by, it started off really as an experiment in their sociology class to talk about profiling. So they were talking about how you can essentially build a picture of somebody for good and for bad. They were looking at race, at somebody's potentially their background, their age, what they'd been up to in life, that sort of thing. So they started off and they looked at who the potential killer could be, the modus operandi. And then they started looking at the victims, and they found very similar patterns with 6 of these victims in the sort of the Tennessee region. And they hit a bit of an impasse. So they came up with the idea of holding a press conference. And they staged this press conference. They had about 60 people there, members of law enforcement, members of the local media, interested people in the community. And after that, the police forces suddenly got a flood of tips. And this, no one had been paying any attention to this for decades. Suddenly they had masses of information. They found one of the victims, they managed to name her, and then they found DNA on her, which actually tied to somebody, and they were able to conclude that he was the killer. He's somebody who was called Jerry Johns, and actually he died in prison in 2015 at the age of 67. The story got even more remarkable because it turned out that he was in prison because he was convicted of attempting to murder another woman who was an exotic dancer in Tennessee. And she survived this incredible attempt. She was picked up by Jerry Johns, and he attempted to murder her, to strangle her, which is how he killed all of the other women. But what happened was that she was hogtied, but the collar of her jacket managed to get between the ligature and her neck. And so he thought he'd killed her because she passed out. She was actually blinded for 3 days by the pressure of what had happened, but she managed to stumble to the road. I mean, bleeding profusely, semi-naked. She was almost actually run over by a truck because she couldn't see that she was picked up. And she had the incredible presence of mind to tell the police that he had stolen her car. He was still driving it. So the police then stopped him. He was arrested and he was convicted of attempted murder for her. And then now what they've managed to do is to piece together all of these other murders and to find the pattern. And what's really remarkable is that the students created a profile of who they thought the killer would likely be. A truck driver, a white man, heterosexual, in the right age range, height, troubled background, all of these details. And Jerry Johns fit it to a T. It was really remarkable what they managed to do. What they are trying to do is they are trying to get this before a grand jury in Tennessee. And the grand jury could essentially listen to all of the evidence and say, yes, if he was alive, we would find that there would be cause to press charges. That's pretty much as good as they're going to get because he's already dead. But this is something that the teacher and the students are really pressing for. And that's sort of the latest part of their work, is building the cases. in the hope that the local prosecutors will actually convene a grand jury and be able to almost convict this man who died in 2015, to get some form of justice for the women. And it's interesting. One of the students told me that when they did their own press conference, that some of the members of law enforcement, he said, and this is his words, were a little bit salty with us, because they were essentially being shown up by a group of high school students. These kids are in their teens. I think it depends, because the women were found over a wide area. So some of them were in Mississippi, some of them were in neighboring Kentucky, some were in West Virginia, and they came from across the country as far afield as New Hampshire, Indiana. So it's a lot of different police forces involved. And the teacher, Alex Campbell, he said to me that he's got a great relationship with the Kentucky police forces, the state police there. They are very keen on social media and on appeals for information and on having tips out there and requesting for tips. Whereas the Tennessee authorities have a very different approach, and they essentially say, okay, leave it with us. We don't really need your help. And I think, you know, they are downplaying the role of the students. And of course, it was due to new technology. Back when this was happening in the 1980s, they didn't have access to this sort of DNA technology and the science that now is available. And so, yes, they were able to identify this one victim and pin her to the killer. The students then spoke to the family of the woman who was identified, the sister. And, you know, one of the students told me that she was ecstatic about it because she had for years and years been searching for answers about her sister. And then the more people they managed to identify, the more stories they came across, of people who just really didn't know what had happened to their loved ones. I mean, many of these women were prostitutes, they were exotic dancers, some of them were orphans, runaways, so they were quite vulnerable women, but that doesn't mean that they weren't missed. And, you know, that they found some of their children who had been wondering why their mother never came home, and were able to essentially tell them what had happened. So that was a big part of their motivation, I think, was to sort of describe what had happened and to provide some form of closure. The teacher wasn't satisfied with solving cold cases. He set another class the task of seeing whether they could look at some potential wrongful convictions. He said to them, essentially, this is the situation. There are wrongful convictions. Have a look at these case files, see if any of these you think warrants further investigation. And so in the autumn of 2018, another group of students began looking at a whole host of potential wrongful convictions. And they looked at hundreds and hundreds of cases, but they actually settled on the case of one woman, Suzanne Johnson. She was in California, no connection to Tennessee, but they really felt that her case was strong. She was convicted in April 1999 of murdering a 6-month-old baby that she was babysitting. She was a grandmother, she was a retired accountant, she was looking after this child, and the child died. Now, she said the child fell from her high chair, was initially fine, but then started having fits, and she called 911 and got the emergency services involved. But the prosecutors say that she essentially killed the child, that she shook the child and killed it. And what the students did was that they found new scientific evidence. They went back over her case files, and they looked at the latest research to essentially prove that a lot of the prosecution's arguments were no longer valid. For instance, the prosecution said that there's no way that this baby could have sustained the injuries that she did just from falling out of a high chair. But it's now known that that was indeed very likely. And Suzanne Johnson was released from prison in April 2020. And she, you know, she told me that this is in a large part, she believes, to these students, because they really researched her case. She said they, you know, they knew more about my case than I did. They were so on top of all of the scientific evidence. They really went through every detail. And speaking to Suzanne and Rick, that's her brother, was just so lovely because they were so grateful to the students. And Rick said, you know, after a while, the decades go by and you get a bit skeptical about people who claim to be interested in your case, because there's so many of them and often they just kind of fizzle and melt away. But these students, they were absolutely committed. And the first Suzanne knew about it was when she received a massive stack of Christmas cards in prison in California from these students. And they said, you know, we're thinking about you, we're working on your case. And she thought that was really nice. I mean, she said Christmas is hard in prison, but she didn't expect any more of it. But then they started corresponding, and Alex Campbell, the teacher, got in touch with her brother and the Innocence Project, which works to free wrongfully convicted people. And they all work together. And what I think is really crucial is that the students, of course, were incredibly adept at social media. So they were really, really lobbying the governor to grant her clemency. They were tweeting at him every day. They were writing to him. They were phoning his office. I mean, on a daily basis, Suzanne said. And she thinks that this really, really made a difference. Actually, the cafe that I'm in right now is where Suzanne Johnston met the students who had worked to free her. She traveled from California to see them in the summer of 2022 because she felt that she really owed them that. And the students, I spoke to one of the students involved and she told me it was so emotional. They were really anxious to meet her, but a bit nervous. And they said she thanked us a million times. It was like we'd known her all our lives. And Suzanne and her brother are coming back to visit the school in September. So there's a real connection there. And as for Alex Campbell, the teacher, he is working on the second series of the podcast that they made. With the help of the students, they are now looking more at the background of Jerry Johns, the serial killer. They called him the Bible Belt Strangler. They're building more of a profile of him, digging into his life. I mean, he's got an unbelievable past. Really astonishing story there. And yes, they're looking to identify more of the victims because there's still an awful lot of unknown victims who have been found in the area, and they're trying to see whether he's potentially responsible for that too. And they're trying to get prosecutions, even though he's died, they're trying to see whether they can actually ultimately get some more justice for the families. What happened was that it originally started in 2018. That was the first class that really sort of sunk their teeth into this project. And it's something that has subsequently been taken up by other classes. They essentially pass the baton on to subsequent classes. And they've just really ran with it. And people have got fascinated by it. I mean, the students just really enjoyed this idea of the true crime, the detective element. And what Alex Campbell said to me when I met him at the school is that it's just made his job such a joy. He's obviously someone who really loves teaching, but this has had all the students asking him, well, how do I go about this? Explain to me how I did this. And Alex has been able to enlist the help of people that he knows throughout the community. So they've had a former FBI agent come and talk to them about criminal profiling. They've had someone who works on a database of missing people come and talk to them about how that works, about identifying people. They've had law enforcement come and talk to them. So they've had a whole range of different people, and they've been helped by somebody who has been researching this for several years for his own podcast. And they've sort of tag teamed their way through it, because the man who was making the podcast, he was the one who would actually go to the sites where these victims were found. He could go and knock on the door. The students obviously weren't able to do that, but the students could do the research and go through all the archives and see what had been said about it. So it was a real team effort all around.